They never called it haunted at first. They called it temperamental, like a kettle that screams before it boils. Act 1 begins the way all true stories do, with a key turning, and the quiet certainty that something inside already knew the sound. Scene opens on the hallway, paint swollen with old rain, floorboards memorizing new footsteps, while the walls hold their breath. Dialogue. Narration. Must choose what to say and what to omit, so here is the omission. The house keeps better records than any of them. Image prompts will later insist on proof, grain, reflection, distance, while motion prompts will shepherd you through 6 seconds at a time, because that's all a person can manage without blinking. For years, they mistook the tapping in the vents for settling and the drafts for thrift. Tonight, though the kitchen clock stutters, the corridor elongates, and the light from the stairwell turns the banister into a spine. The kettle begins to scream. Something else does not stop. The house adjusted to them by changing the rules in increments too small to contest. On the second night, a spoon left in the sink rotated its handle toward the drain like a compass on a trembling map. On the third, the upstairs window refused to show the same sky as the yard below. Denial was practical, a tarp over a widening hole, but whoever listened longest could hear a different rhythm woven into ordinary sounds. A cupboard door sighing in syllables, a stair whining vowels. They slept poorly and dreamed with precision. A key that did not fit any lock on earth. A room that existed only when the lights were off. Mornings were worse because the house kept residue. A smell of damp paper. A sugar bowl full of salt. When the power blinked at 3:13, a time no clock chose voluntarily, they learned to keep their voices low, as if raising them might teach the walls how to echo back names. They divided the house into safe zones without admitting it. Places where nothing had yet argued with reality. The front porch swing, though it creaked like an old throat, never moved unless touched. The pantry shelves kept quiet as long as labels faced forward. But the hallway mirror rewritten faces with fatigue that didn't belong to them. And the attic exhaled a temperature that respected no season. They taped the basement door shut, a bright strip like a smile too wide, and told themselves it was for the draft. Nights acquired a second gravity. Every step took more effort, and even laughter fell short of the floor. On a windless evening, a cluster of flies appeared in the cold corner above the piano, all at once, like a thought. That was the first time the house showed timing, a sense of when attention balanced on the rim, and it tipped them without touching. When the voices began, they did not resemble voices. Air, when squeezed through the right surfaces, pretends it knows words. The ventilation grills, the keyholes, the seam under the basement door. Each contributed a syllable until meaning adhered like lint. It called no names, just the shapes of them, and sometimes giggled softly like a jug, half full, rolling under a table. Water misbehaved. Faucets sputtered with the patience of someone learning a song, and the bathtub released a single pearl of black water that stained the enamel like an eclipse. By then, the photographs had started to warp, straight back slumping in frames. Smiles softened into smudges. Nobody confessed to fear aloud. Instead, they cleaned. They folded towels with precise edges and vacuumed in crisp, parallel lines, as if order could convince the house to mirror it. The house listened, attentive, like a student picking its favorite teacher. It escalated without spectacle. A mug migrated 3 tiles left. The front door locked itself while everyone stared at it. Somewhere between 2 and 3 each night, a weight took the stairs, skipping the 3rd step every time, teaching them which creak was missing. That predictable omission became a lullaby and a warning. Not everything here wanted surprise. Some of it wanted habit. They learned that the house could be bartered with. Offer the piano a simple melody, and the pantry would stop rattling. Close the blinds in the room no one used, and the hallway mirror would keep its counsel. The bargain failed on a Friday when the hallway exhaled and the attic string lifted without wind. The bulb burned to a black bead. In the stunned dark, they heard something new, like a throat practicing a word. starting with the consonant they all shared. Morning arrived brittle, as if the light had been scored with a knife before being pushed through the windows. The house pretended to be ordinary by groaning in the plumbing and purring in the fridge motor, but every sound came with a partner. A faint second voice a half step behind. On the kitchen table lay a damp ring. No cup had made, oval and smudged, as though a face had rested there to listen. They tried routine the way sailors try knots. Coffee, toast, a list, an apology to no one in particular. The pantry door inched open when backs were turned, not out of malice, but like a dog creeping closer for warmth. When the mail slot clacked, the hallway delivered a smell of rain that hadn't fallen. Among the envelopes was one addressed in a looping hand to current occupant. The ink slightly sunk into the paper, as if written under pressure. The seal had adhered to more than glue. When torn, it made a small, wet sound. The letter contained a floor plan that almost matched the house, drawn in graphite and interrupted by small X's where no doors existed. In the parlor, an X sat precisely where the rug buckled. Under that bulge, the boards were newer, less varnish sunk into the grain. They pried a strip free and found a cavity lined with old newspaper, edges petrified to lace. Inside lay a brass key, heavy enough to alter posture, and a photograph of the house standing too close to the road, as if eager to eavesdrop. The key did not fit any lock they knew, but it made the air feel crowded. A mineral taste, a weight added to the tongue. Later, while everyone was pretending to be busy in separate rooms, the floor plan shifted on the table. The axis slightly migrated, and a new mark appeared where none had been. At the top of the stairs, centered beneath the hatch, a small square drawn darker than the rest. Moral. Night took a deliberate shape, settling over the roof like a fitted lid. At the marked square, the ceiling breathed, a slow inhale that raised the thin dust to a wavering hail. Something above shifted its weight carefully, as if considerate of joints. They brought a stepladder and the practical bravado of people who have run out of pretending. The hatch string pecked the air like a patient bird. They didn't say the question out loud, "Who put the X?" But the answer came anyway in the cooled note of the house, a tone that made the filling in teeth sing. The first tug yielded resistance like skin adhered to cloth. The second let go all at once. Warm air spilled down, smelling of pennies and moss. A box waited just inside, wrapped in oilcloth and ribbon so brittle it powdered at a touch, the knot cinched with care bordering on love, or its opposite. Inside the oilcloth lay scraps of handwriting that smelled faintly of vinegar and waterlogged wood, each page numbered wrong, as if memory had learned to count by echo. The sentences were blunt and tender. The house does not like closed doors. The house prefers hymns in a low voice. The house will answer a question if asked without fear. There were testaments of exchanges. Leave, milk at the threshold and the pipes will quiet. Return the key if you borrow a room. The last note was a plea, written over itself until the fibers went bald. Do not teach it your names. Reading them aloud felt like feeding. A draft licked the pages as if to turn them faster, greedy for the next confession. They stacked the paper neatly and tried to decide whether kindness could be a trap. The house hummed in the ductwork, satisfied, and the refrigerator gave a sympathetic click, like a signature. They tested the rules like swimmers testing a current. A dish of milk on the threshold turned to a skin of gray within minutes, yet the rattling pipes settled, as if lulled. A hymn hummed under breath made the pantry door close gently, but a raised voice, in the same key, woke something in the walls that walked away, and then back again, closer each time. The key slept in a bowl on the mantel and sang faintly when the hour changed. A pin dropped in the skull. That night the house tried a new trick. It answered a question not asked aloud. Who put the X? Footsteps moved in the ceiling and stopped over the bedroom. Then the closet door clicked, and the light inside came on by itself. Revealing coats turned the wrong direction. Their shoulders bowed as if listening. The air felt crowded with agreement. From the mirror's edge, Condensation spelled a single syllable that wasn't a name, but new one. By the third week, the house began to imitate. It borrowed the rhythm of footsteps and returned them from the wrong direction, borrowed the hiss of the kettle and braided it with a whisper that almost formed a question. The key on the mantel throbbed with a sound too low for hearing, but not for bone. Standing near it felt like leaning against a generator. A door left ajar closed to a courteous click whenever a voice gentled. It slammed when frustration rose, not to punish but to coach. The letter's rules had seemed like folklore, yet every compliance produced reward, every lapse a lesson. At 3:13, the plumbing sang 3 notes in a pause, then repeated an obedience drill for pipes. In the mirror, condensation no longer formed by accident, but in strokes, a hand learning to write backward with devotion. They practiced restraint in sentences and steps, measuring the distance between words the way one measures a cliff's edge in fog. They decided to ask a question out loud, precise as a needle. The letter had warned about fear, but fear was already a constant like humidity, so they spoke slowly in the hallway where the sound traveled clean. "What do you want?" The reply arrived in choreography. A window shade unrolled a 1/4 inch, a drawer inhaled, the piano accepted a single note and held it past reason. On the floor plan, the X's shifted again with a dry rasp, aligning into a path from threshold to stair to hatch to the small square that hadn't been there on any blueprint human hands signed. The word in the mirror shortened to a symbol, not a name but the shape of one, as if drafting a signature. They realized then that appeasement had taught the house their timing, and timing was all appetite neat. Somewhere inside the ductwork, a valve opened with the intimacy of a mouth. That night the hatch refused to stay shut. Twice the string knotted itself. Twice the knot untied with the patient nick of unseen teeth. Warm air pooled at the landing, sweet with dust and something metallic, and a draft threaded from the closet to the attic as if the house were tasting its own corridor. They armed themselves with ordinary bravery. A flashlight that stuttered, a length of twine, a promise not to separate. The key lay heavy in a pocket where it clicked lightly against a coin like a charm negotiating allegiance. At the top of the ladder, darkness had texture. Not absence but fabric, the kind that drapes and remembers shoulders. When the beam finally bit through, it licked along rafters, furred with lint, jars of screws, a child's shoe with its lace fossilized into a loop, and a handbell nested in rags. The bell shone as if polished daily by a devoted, invisible thumb. The bell was heavier than it looked, its handle worn to a smooth oval by hands that had practiced. When lifted, the attic exhaled with relief so pronounced it almost felt grateful. The first chime was an accident. The second, a test. Sound compressed the air until the cobwebs leaned, and from the rooms below came the hush a congregation gives a pulpit. The bell's note threaded downstairs and tugged on thresholds. Doors adjusted themselves to polite angles. Drawers sat flush in their holes. The piano's lid rose without touch, and in the kitchen a tap shut with a courteous twist. They rang it a 3rd time, and the house answered with footsteps that familiar weight, skipping the 3rd stair but now pausing at the landing as if to bow. The mirror surrendered its symbol to clarity, the stroke resolving into the first letter of a name they refused to read aloud. The bell's mouth stilled, satisfied. Control felt possible for a single hour, and that was the most dangerous hour of all. They rehearsed a ritual. Bell, hymn under breath, question shaped like courtesy. The house responded like a host, arranging its furniture of drafts and ticks, until the moment someone laughed from relief, and the laugh clipped into a cough that sounded like a spoken name. Silence collapsed inward, the way a tent drops when its center pole is kicked. In the kitchen, the damp oval returned on the table but deeper, as if pressed by a face delighted to be recognized. The floor plan's path darkened like veins. From the attic came a soft dinging, not of metal but of glass, struck by fingernails, counting toward a number none of them wanted to meet. They hid the bell in a drawer, and the drawer slid back open with patience. The house had learned their confidence. Hunger prefers its season. Rain drilled at the eaves until the house replied in percussion, a private conversation of drip and drum. The bell slept where the drawer couldn't quite contain it, mouth angled like a listener. They agreed aloud to stop playing host and to stop asking questions, but the house, practiced in etiquette, offered hospitality anyway. Warm air in the hall, the gentle tucking of doors, the pantry jar obligingly loosening its dark lid. The floor plan on the table showed a new annotation, a tiny arrow that curled toward the basement, drawn with a line quality no human hand would choose. Too steady, too patient. When the lights dimmed, it wasn't protest, it was theater. From the mirror, the half-made name dissolved into breath and reassembled as a circle with a notch, a sigil the mouth could nearly pronounce. The air seemed flavored with copper and cloves. Somewhere below, water coursed in a pipe that should have been dry, running toward the part of the house no one had earned. They peeled the tape with the care of surgeons and met a smell that had no season, a blend of old soap, iron, and a sweetness too late to be welcome. Treads groaned with the indulgence of a stage taking weight. The bulb at the bottom flickered to a steady jaundice, as if pleased to be useful again. Shadows arranged themselves into furniture, and between them stood a utility sink, porcelain crazed into a map, its drain ringed by a stain, the color of old tea. On the wall hung 3 pegs. On the pegs, nothing. Under the pegs, a scuff shaped like a small heel pivoting in indecision. The key in a pocket warmed as if near a flame. They said nothing because nothing seemed safest, but the house had learned to read silence as a blank signature. A low tone arrived, too flat for comfort, and the far corner deepened, acquiring the depth of a door that had never needed hinges. The corner was not a door, and then it was, the wall learning an opening like a word mispronounced until it fits the mouth. Cold lifted from it, as if a cellar's second cellar had been uncorked. Inside, space narrowed quickly, wood close on both shoulders, a crawl rather than a hall, and along the right side a series of small recesses carved with domestic reverence, shelf, niche, swallow of air. In each niche lay an object so ordinary it felt ceremonial. Button, bottle cap, stub of chalk, a marble that held a night sky. The chalk marked tally lines in groups of 7, interrupted mid-count. A gentle tapping began above, moving room to room as if taking attendance. The bell in the drawer upstairs chimed once without touch, a sound contained, approving. From the far end of the narrow came a whisper that had never been air, not language either, but the suggestion of a trade. Give something small and be allowed to keep something large. They answered with the only currency left. Time. 6 breaths measured, 6 heartbeats held still, 6 steps backward, then forward, a cadence that matched the house's preferred number like a password, spoken with bare feet. The passage exhaled. The niches released a draft sweet as attic cedar, and in the sink upstairs the faucet coughed once, rinsing the stain to a paler ring. The floor plan on the table changed in their absence. The X collapsed into a single dot over the attic hatch, and along the margins a new phrase bloomed in pencil. Not letters, but the architecture of them. Strokes rehearsing the architecture of them. First sound of every person who lived here. The bell, now on the mantel, rolled to the edge and did not fall, balanced on its lip like a coin refusing decision. From the mirror came a soft fogging in the precise height of a face, and when wiped, it returned at once, as if breath were standing on the other side. The negotiation ended when the house decided it had been polite enough. At 3:13, the familiar steps mounted, skipped the third as always, then halted with an intimacy that pinched the air thin. The refrigerator sighed off. A cupboard eased open and offered a glass that slid to the counter and did not break, as if raised by a careful waiter. In that soft clink lay the answer to a question no one had asked tonight. Do you accept the terms? The bell tilted and kissed wood, a single kiss, and the attic string lifted without assistance, pointing, not pleading. They gathered in the hall because tradition had taught them where to stand. The name in the mirror was almost itself. One letter short, a hunger with a missing tooth. Behind the attic hatch, the warmth receded like a hand under a door. They understood then that the trade would take place whether they signed or not. Something small for something large. The house had already chosen which. They decided not to sleep, which meant they napped in pieces and pretended to be awake. The house liked this new rhythm, the soft relay of vigilance passing from room to room, the way a vigil becomes a habit rather than a purpose. At the appointed minute the air tightened. The third step remembered its omission, and something caressed the corridor with footsteps that felt practiced enough to be kind. The bell refused to be found where it had been left, not vanished, but deferred, sound waiting in the wood. On the table, the floor plan gathered itself into a single corridor that could not exist in lumber. Following it meant walking in place while the house moved around them. They whispered the not name to prove they could stop before the final letter, and the mirror answered with a bead of breath that divided, doubled, became a row of ovals, like a choir of mouths. The bargain, once theoretical, began to outline its invoice. Morning arrived with a counterfeit cheerfulness, the kind that laughs too often and too high. The house imitated domestic competence. The refrigerator resumed its hum, a beam of sun laid itself down the kitchen, and the pantry door leaned shut, as if self-conscious. They tested normalcy like a bridge repaired with string. A dish clinked, a faucet sighed, and the oilcloth from the attic crackled with a dry, papery approval. Yet underneath, the ducts carried a pulse that synchronized with theirs, and in the vents a whisper learned to count in groups of 6. They agreed to leave, not as a decision but as a sentence shaped to see if it could be spoken. The house replied with a softness that felt like permission, which frightened them more than refusal. Keys disappeared for an hour and then returned to a place none of them would have chosen, exactly where a hand would reach without looking. Permission, then, or rehearsal. They reached the porch and discovered the outside had been gently edited. Sound thinned, like air at altitude. Birdsong arrived late to its own notes. The street's geometry leaned. The house did not trap them. It slowed them. An etiquette of restraint rather than force. At the car, the trunk opened before touch, and inside lay the brass key on the folded blanket, a placement so considerate it bruised. The key had never been in the car. Metal remembered warmth it shouldn't. They carried it back because leaving it felt like abandoning a sleeping animal, and as the threshold crossed underfoot, the floor exhaled with relief that smelled faintly of lavender and old pennies. It was then they realized the house had been teaching the world outside to accommodate its rules. Distance no longer promised escape. It only lengthened the path through the same room. The mirror, when glanced at, showed the porch from a second earlier, like a memory rehearsing itself into prophecy. They returned the key to its bowl and tried ceremonial kindness. A hymn under breath, a glass of water on the sill, hands laid flat on the table as if swearing. The house approved by aligning shadows with the precision of a draftsperson. Then it asked for proof they had learned. The attic string rose, waited, dropped. The bell rang from nowhere with a tone that folded the silence neatly. The floor plan sketched a new figure at the edge, a small square set apart like a crib in an empty room. They refused the word the mirror offered, but it didn't matter. The room answered to it anyway. Somewhere between the third stair and the hall, a presence sorted itself into patience, and patience into procedure. A cupboard door steadied as if bracing for a pulse. They moved together, 4 points on a narrow circuit, unwilling to divide because division was how a mouth fit more than one name. The invoice arrived at 3:13 without paper. First the house borrowed heat from the air until the skin on their arms pebbled. Then it lifted sound from their throats so breathing felt counterfeit. Finally, it offered the trade in a generosity that could not be refused. A toy disappeared from where it had slept for years and reappeared inside the hidden passage, tucked into a niche like a keepsake returned after a long, polite theft. In exchange, the pipes silenced, the mirror cleared. The third stair sounded once, fully, as if easing a cramped joint. They understood the terms, something small, yes, but chosen by the house. The choice would escalate. They spoke the almost name together, and stopped before the end, and the house finished it softly with the missing letter. Not aloud, but to the bones. It felt like a hand on the shoulder from a friend who wants too much. It felt like agreement already signed. The day thinned to a chalky dusk that left edges blunt and silences wide. The house had adopted their caution and refined it, turning pauses into instructions, hesitations into paths. At 3:12, a minute early to show it could, the third stair voiced itself and then kept quiet as if pleased to be noticed. The floor plan's isolated square swelled darker, its pencil grain fat with certainty, and the hidden passage breathed a cooler draft that tasted of cellar apples and old liturgy. They had spent the afternoon gathering everything small that mattered, trinkets and notes, and a few hopeful tools, and found the house had already inventoried them. Every pocket felt pre-counted. The not name hummed in the ductwork until it was almost a tune. When they tried to sing anything else, words slid off their tongues as if lacquered. It occurred to them that the house had been patient, not out of kindness, but out of appetite pacing itself for a proper meal. The first theft that mattered was time, and it happened mid-sentence. A word began at the lips in one room and finished in another, 3 steps and a heartbeat away, leaving a seam of silence that stung like a paper cut. Then sound narrowed to a point. The refrigerator's click grew cathedral large. The sink's drip became a metronome that advanced the floor plan by degrees, each drop a darker hatch over the square. The mirror refused breath entirely, glass going colder than the air around it, frost opaling the surface from within. A chair pulled itself tidily to the table. The key weighed the palm until the wrist shook. A gravity trick, with no mathematics. They thought of opening every window, but air already answered to the house, and the panes looked outward, with a gaze trained to watch them, not the street. Above them, the attic learned to inhale for longer than lungs could hope to rival, the slow preface to a held note. When the bell rang from an empty place, it used their own cadence against them. 6 seconds of swell, a throat of silence, then a tone that flattened thought to paper. Doors eased to 90 degrees as if submitting to inspection. The hidden passage summoned with weather, a breeze that moved against the house's seams, tugging at hair and sleeves, the kind of draft that has an opinion. Inside, the niches had rearranged themselves for guests. Objects sat in order of sacrifice: button, chalk, marble. Then the stuffed fox in pride of place, the fur gleaming as if licked. At the far end where the passage pinched, boards had been polished by the knees of the patient. The square on the floor plan did not mark a room, they realized. It marked a word the house wanted them to say together while standing inside that narrow. They had practiced stopping before the last letter. The house had practiced finishing it for them. Staging it for them. They tried refusal politely. A hymn in a braver key, a glass of tap water upgraded to warm milk, a sentence about leaving spoken without a tremor. Courtesy failed with ceremony. The house switched to law. The third stair sounded its missing step as a gavel. The attic string rose hard enough to leave a groove in the air. In the kitchen, a drawer opened to reveal the bell laid on a dish towel like a surgical instrument, handle toward their hands. They debated without words and understood one another perfectly, because the house lent comprehension the way a stage lends light. The rule was simple: ring it. Stand where the plan says. Finish the name. In exchange, a mercy too large to refuse. No more cold breathing the glass. No more counting down halls. No more inventory of small losses. Mercy with a mouth. They held the bell together and found that it steadied their hands even as it sipped their fear like steam. At 3:13 to the second, the house took choice out of their hands by making agreement feel like rescue. They stood inside the narrow 4 breaths plated into one, the bell raised, air pressed close as wool. The tone, when it came, seemed quiet but had weight. It pushed dust aside, ironed cobwebs flat, and shook the word loose from their throats. They stopped 1 letter short. The house finished it as promised, a whisper shaped like a key turning. Something opened that had not been built. Heat flicked off everywhere and returned in a fine rush, carrying a scent of roses nested in rust. In the niches, the smallest objects crawled a fraction toward the stuffed fox, as if obeying a tide. The square on the plan lightened, then cleared, leaving that corner of paper blank as if the tax had been paid. Above, the attic exhaled relief that did not belong to any of them. Below, a latch clicked, satisfied. Silence arrived like a verdict, full of paperwork and stamps. The finished name did not echo. It nested. The air thinned to the careful pressure of a hand checking a pulse, then eased, leaving the rooms too orderly, a politeness after the feast. In the glass, breath didn't fog, because the glass was already breathing from the other side. The walls had learned their cadence and no longer needed to rehearse. Every hinge knew when to settle. Every vent remembered the pitch of their whisper. The floor plan, relieved of its black square, lay pale and unremarkable. A face after makeup has been removed, innocent, and therefore suspicious. They waited for a crash or a cry or proof that the trade was complete. But the house preferred subtler trophies. It kept a piece of time, a sliver shaved from each moment, so that laughter tripped half a second late and footsteps arrived just before feet. Appetite, satisfied, became habit, and habit is how possession hides. They decided to leave in the bright hour, trusting sun to bleach the edges of fear. The house obliged by becoming generous. Doors opened and stayed that way. The refrigerator offered a new hum. The porch presented dry boards to steady shoes. Walking out felt like exiting a theater after a matinee. Eyes unadjusted to a daylight that seemed counterfeit. The street repeated itself with soft courtesy, cul-de-sac looping into cul-de-sac, mailboxes greeting them twice. Far off, clouds held their shapes like memorized lines. They discovered the key in a pocket. None of them had filled and understood the trick. Permission is a leash, and a leash is proof of ownership. When they turned back, the rooms had not moved, but their shadows had, patient as pets waiting by bowls. They could leave, and the house would come with them in the difference between steps and the soft collapse of words that should land together and arrive apart. They returned not in surrender, but to renegotiate. Upstairs, the hatch breathed lightly, a sleeper pretending. The name in the mirror had learned to trace itself without condensation, a dry scrawl that felt carved. They brought no milk, no hymn, no pleading. They brought the bell and a decision to ring it wrong. 6 seconds reversed are still 6 seconds, but they taste different, like unsaying a word. They counted backward and lifted the clapper into a choke of cloth, so the note released crooked and thin. The house winced, cupboards settling off plumb, frames tilting a degree. Photographs stiffened, then blinked, then looked away, faces sidelong as if embarrassed. The third stare tried its full voice and cracked, the splinter loud as a snapped rule. They did not speak the name. They spoke their own silence instead, a shared refusal meant for the space between syllables, and for the first time the attic seemed to wonder whether it could forget. Counter-rituals are crude, but honest. They opened every door wide and let drafts argue, set every chair a little crooked, read the rules aloud and mispronounced them, poured the milk down the sink, and ran hot water until the metal sank. The bell lay on its side and did not roll, exhausted from being obeyed. In the hidden passage, offerings slid backward in their niches, as if the tide had remembered another moon. The floor plan, placed on the stove, browned at the edges and curled, and with it, the house shed a thin coat of certainty that flaked into the air like dander. A name written too many times can become a picture can be turned to the wall. The house, deprived of etiquette, showed its impatience. Pipes rattled without rhythm. The attic string jerked gracelessly. The third stair sulked into silence. Hunger without manners is smaller. It still wanted, but it had to ask. They left at twilight because departures, like endings, prefer an audience, and dusk applauds softly. Behind them, the house weighed with the posture of a story that knows another version is already being told. It had kept something, seconds shaved thin, a cadence, the habit of their almost name, and those things would follow, hitchhikers, in the bloodstream of hours. The porch did not groan. The door did not slam. True hauntings rarely demand flourishes. On the curb, the air felt ungilded, heavy with unpracticed weather. They spoke to one another in short sentences and listened hard to ensure beginnings met ends. When a distant window breathed, they did not look back. The price, like most prices, would be paid in installments. A mirror that fogs out of season, a step that's always quiet, a bell-shaped pause in conversations. They walked on, and the street did not loop. The house kept learning, and somewhere, a different door unlatches to the sound of a name.